Hey guys, it's Lindsay, and in today's video, I want to show you a quick tutorial on how to make realistic looking pumpkin cookies. These are pumpkins that have lots of depths and shadows and highlights, and they look like pumpkins you could have picked off of a patch yourself. But first, I want to show you how I used to make my pumpkin cookies, and maybe it's how you make your pumpkin cookies right now. It's really just splitting your pumpkin into a few different sections, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 sections, and filling in those sections, letting them crust over so that you have a little bit of dimension, and then putting a stem on top. And that's it. It's pretty easy, but it doesn't look realistic. So let me show you a trick I just learned. So first, I'm going to actually redraw my sections of the pumpkin. First, I'm going to bring the stem down a little bit further into the center and make those sections, at least the ones in the front, further down the pumpkin. So you can see they're not even necessarily, they're not center, they're all kind of a little bit wonky, but the ones that are coming out from the center actually start from the bottom of the stem and come up and over. And so that's creating a little bit more depth and dimension in that pumpkin, making it look like it's actually wrapping around the stem. This minor change in how you make your pumpkin cookie will actually just make it look so much more dimensional and make it look much more realistic. From here on out, it's really the same technique. I am creating different sections with my icing, and I'm going to fill in every other section so that they're perfectly defined as their own kind of puffed out piece of the pumpkin. I'm going to let those sections crust over and dry for about 5 to 10 minutes, at least until I can touch the top of the icing and the icing won't come off on my finger. And then once they're dry enough, I'll fill in the remaining sections. I'm adding a little squiggle in the middle so that the icing doesn't sink back in, because I'm only using my flood consistency icing. I'm not using a piping consistency icing to outline and then a flood to fill. I'm just using one, so it is rather thin. And I want to make sure that those sections stay puffed up and have a lot of dimension to them. When I'm making cookies like this and I want the icing to be a little bit taller than it normally is, I don't want it to be one flat surface. I want there to be a little bit more dimension. I do use a slightly thicker piping consistency icing. So typically I use a 10-second consistency. Here I'm using about a 15 to 20-second consistency icing. So that means my scribe tool will really come in handy to help, get rid of any bubbles or any bumps in the icing. And once the last remaining sections of the pumpkin have had a chance to crust over for about 5 minutes, I'm going to go in and add the stem. I'm adding the stem in 2 sections just to give it a little bit more texture, a little bit more dimension, but that's totally unnecessary because I'm going to go in and add some texture in on top anyways, and we're going to be using some food coloring to shade the stem as well as the pumpkin later. So that step is not totally necessary. I am using my scribe tool to drag down that brown icing into the sections of the pumpkin to make it look like the stem is really coming out of the pumpkin. Once the stem has dried, I'm going to stipple on some more of that icing with a clean brush. I'm going to use the same technique to add a little bit of texture to the pumpkin as well. So I just add little dots of orange icing to the different sections of the pumpkin, and then I use my brush to just stipple it on to really add a lot of texture and some bumps, because no pumpkin is perfectly smooth and shiny. It always has a little bit of texture, and that's what makes them look so cool. Now that my cookie is completely dry, I can go ahead and start painting on it to create a lot more dimension in this pumpkin. The first step is to use brown gel food coloring diluted with a little bit of Everclear. You could use vodka or water instead if you prefer, to really define each of the sections of the pumpkin. I'm painting it right in the seam of that pumpkin. Using a slightly larger brush and a slightly more diluted version of that brown, I'm going in and just blending out that brown color, really pulling it into more of the top of each of the sections. You want to create the illusion of shadow between each of the sections and also on the very bottom of the pumpkin. So we want it to look like the light is coming up from the top, shining down on the pumpkin, so that there will be shadow around the base of the pumpkin. So I'm bringing that color up, through the middle of the section as well, because the pumpkins, aren't perfectly rounded. They have a lot of bumps and, like I said, texture and all that. So you want to create the illusion of that with your color, with your brown food coloring. To help blend the shadows into the highlights, I'm painting on a little bit of orange just in the center, just like I said, to help blend up so it's not going from dark to light immediately. You have a little bit of blending. So I painted on some orange, and then I'm going in with some white gel food coloring, and I'm painting on the highlights on the top of the pumpkin. So on the top of each section of the pumpkin, I'm painting this and I'm blending in the white to make it look like a nice shiny highlight on the top of the pumpkin. And just like with the highlights, I'm bringing it down kind of in the section so it looks like it has some bumps and ridges. Next is to paint the stem using a dark brown in various shades. So some areas are going to be darker, some are going to be lighter, just to create a little bit more texture. And lastly, I'm going to go in with some black powder. This is a Master Elite powder from the Sugar Art. So this is a really, really dark black that is really super saturated. A little bit goes a long way. I'm using this on a stiff, flat bristled brush, and I'm painting it just like I did with the shadows in the very beginning. I'm painting it between the sections of the pumpkin. I'm painting it on the very bottom and kind of bringing it up a little bit through the top of the sections of the pumpkin, as well as the base of the stem. This creates much more deep shadows, and it just adds a lot more depth and dimension. If you don't feel like you have enough highlight like I do here, I'm adding in a little bit more white food coloring just on top to create a little bit more of a layered look so that white really stands out. I do like to paint over some of that white with a little yellow because that just looks a little bit more realistic to me on a pumpkin. So basically, that's all it is. It's all about adding highlights and shadows and making that pumpkin really stand out. If you want to see more cookie decorating tutorials like this one, hit the subscribe button below.